Hello, hello. I'm Key with Travel Made Personal, and this is part 3 of my Florida Ghost Town Romantic series. 2 weeks ago, I presented the history and local theories that I found regarding the Florida ghost towns of Montauk and Capulet. We learned that folks from the area back in the mid to late 1800s were avid readers who may have loved William Shakespeare. Perhaps this is what inspired the names of these communities. Last week, we toured the Marion County ghost town of Romeo, where there were still some remnants of the old town, such as the Romeo Church of God and Cemetery, some old abandoned vehicles, and the charcoal kilns from the old Pioneer Charcoal Company in the 60s. Today, we'll wrap up this romantic series with the ghost town of Juliette, also in Marion County, Florida. So if you haven't watched those first 2 videos yet, this is a great time to pause and go back to see them. So the ghost town of Juliette, with an extra T and E, is located just 7 miles south of Romeo, which was many years older than the Juliette community. Juliette started as Canton, which was originally settled particularly for cotton and livestock farming, which led to the development of the region. The development of railroads in the late 19th century helped stimulate growth in the area by increasing trade and accessibility. Towns like this one were established as part of the railroad expansion. So the town was originally named Canton, but from 1887 to 1889, the establishment was referred to as Blue Springs. Blue Springs was part of the local economy driven by agriculture and tourism. The springs' natural beauty attracted visitors for recreational purposes, and the area supported farming and small-scale industry. The railroad network expanded in Marion County, contributing to easier access, and Blue Springs became a local tourist destination as wealthy visitors from the north, as well as Floridians, came to enjoy the clear waters and natural surroundings. Naturally, this increased the flow of visitors and commerce in the area. Investors hoped the area would develop into a major resort or agricultural center, and speculation began about real estate development. But by 1889, the growth and expectations for Blue Springs began to taper off because other areas of Florida, such as Tampa, were drawing more attention for development. So Blue Springs remained a relatively small community. To this day, the springs that once were Blue Springs continues to retain its scenic and recreational appeal despite human activity impacting the natural surroundings, which started way back when Blue Springs became a tourist attraction. Then the name changed to Juliette in 1889, and around that same time, a post office was established. The local historian, Mr. David Cook, that we talked about last week, suspected Canton was renamed to Juliette because it sounded more romantic. Juliette remained a small rural community with its economy primarily based on agriculture, particularly citrus and livestock farming. See, back in the day, there was a banker in Ocala by the name of John F. Dunn who was expanding the railroads in the area. The very same John Dunn that sold 240 acres of land to Reverend John Brooke Panay, which he named Montauk Groves. John F. Dunn was born in 1844 in South Carolina. He made his way to Florida at age 16 and served in the Civil War. He attended Eastman's Business College in New York and then came to Ocala in 1874 to study law with one of the town's leading citizens, S.M.G. Gary. Within 2 years, they became law partners. But after 6 years, Mr. Dunn gave up his law practice to pursue his various business interests. He got into the banking industry by making real estate loans, planting orange groves, and developing residential neighborhoods in Ocala. He was a key figure in founding the Silver Springs, Ocala, and Gulf Railroad in 1879, which spurred development in Marion County before becoming the president of the Bank of Ocala in 1882. During his time at the bank, he became a prominent commercial investor and businessman. At some point, the state of Florida had given Mr. Dunn loads of land, and Canton was a stop on the railroad line. But the railroad folks, like Mr. Dunn, needed to sell their land. Building railroads was an expensive endeavor, and selling land helped to generate the capital needed for constructing tracks, depots, and infrastructure. Railroads often received large grants from the government, which they could then sell to fund the development. They were able to attract settlers, businesses, and industries by selling land along the rail lines, which increased the value of adjacent properties and generated revenue for the railroads. More settlements meant more passengers and freight traffic, boosting railroad profitability. During economic booms, like the phosphate boom we'll talk about in a minute, the land in areas where railroads were being built increased in value. So folks like Mr. Dunn profited by selling land when demand was high due to the development of new towns and industries. This allowed them to diversify their investments by reinvesting in other profitable ventures, such as the booming phosphate industry or local infrastructure projects. So selling land helped railroad pioneers like Mr. Dunn recover costs, drive development, and seize new business opportunities. So how do you think they sold their land back then? Well, they created brochures and put out newspaper ads. And in those brochures and newspaper ads, which would you find more attractive in an ad, Romeo and Canton or Romeo and Juliet? Perhaps Mr. Cook was onto something with his suspicion, right? In 1887, Mr. Dunn helped organize the Withlacoochee and Waukegan Land Company, which led to the establishment of the town of Dunnellon, named after him. He partnered with Albertus Vogt in the phosphate industry, facilitating the discovery and exploitation of the richest hard rock phosphate deposits in the world. He leveraged his wealth and political influence to finance large land acquisitions and phosphate ventures, helping form the Dunnellon Phosphate Company in 1889. His legacy in Marion County is tied to his role in driving the economic boom through phosphate mining and railroad development. See, phosphate is vital for fertilizer and gunpowder, which was discovered in Dunnellon, Florida. By 1890, the town's phosphate industry attracted thousands of workers and led to the formation of many mining companies. Working conditions were harsh, though, with diseases like typhoid and malaria rampant, but wages were higher than farming jobs. However, after World War I, the phosphate industry declined due to market changes, leading to an economic downturn. Other industries like turpentine and lumber briefly replaced mining, but Dunnellon's population dwindled. The last phosphate mine on Dunnellon closed in 1966, and today, forests have reclaimed the area. Dunnellon was incorporated in 1891 due to the population boom and economic growth through phosphate mining and railroads, and Juliette became part of Dunnellon. Juliette's post office was abolished in 1926, and the name Juliette all but disappeared. In the 1930s and 40s, the natural springs and surrounding area became a focal point for tourism and recreation. The springs gained popularity for the clear waters and scenic beauty, so the community around them adopted the name Rainbow Springs to better reflect the identity of the local attraction and to draw in tourists. The phosphate industry began declining, which reduced the local economic activity. While tourism to the springs continued to grow, it was very slow going. So by renaming Juliette to Rainbow Springs, they were able to market the area more effectively as a destination, and the springs were later developed into a tourist attraction with glass-bottom boat rides, a zoo, waterfalls, gardens, and other features during the 1950s theme park era. The new name highlighted the natural wonder of the springs, which became the region's defining feature. Rainbow Springs then became one of Florida's early tourist destinations. But by the late 1960s, larger attractions like Disney World overshadowed smaller parks like this, which led to the decline of Rainbow Springs as a commercial theme park. It ended up closing in 1974 due to financial struggles. But in the late 1980s, the state of Florida purchased the property and began restoring the natural springs, focusing on conservation and public recreation. Then in 1995, Rainbow Springs was reopened as a state park, emphasizing the area's natural beauty and ecological significance. Today, it's a popular spot for ecotourism, offering activities like swimming, kayaking, hiking, and wildlife viewing, and it's only $2 to visit. Within a restricted area of Rainbow Springs State Park lies Juliette Cemetery. It has a few gravestones and markers, but it's relatively small and overgrown compared to more prominent historical sites. The cemetery is relatively hidden and not widely marked. It sits in a wooded area of the park northeast of the main spring area and would require a bit of exploration to find. But again, it is in a restricted area of the park. Don't go trespassing, y'all. So overall, Juliette's physical presence has largely faded, but its history contributes to the broader narrative of the region's past. So, in researching the history of Romeo and Juliet, I did not come across any hints as to why the towns were named such, other than the suggestions of giving them more romantic names for marketing purposes. Do you think that's all there was to it? Or could there have been a secret love affair that inspired these names? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Let's discuss. Now that said, there are other accounts of the romantic local legend of Romeo and Juliet. For example, in his 1995 book, Florida Place Names, Clerk Emeritus and historian of the Florida House of Representatives, Alan Morris, described two Florida lovers whose families didn't get along, and that the story ended as tragically as the Veronese, as they say in Italian. But he offers no further details. Pioneering local journalist Francis DeVore suggested in a column of the Star Banner in 1995 that Romeo and Juliet were whistle stops on a track in western Marion County, named for a swain who boarded the train at one point and got off at another on regular visits to court his lady love. So was it a tragic love story on a marketing ploy to sell the land? Perhaps we'll never know, but it sure does make a great story, doesn't it? Ironically, the two lovers are back together again as an upper-end country club restaurant called Romeo's was recently opened in the upscale development of Juliet Falls on State Road 40. It's just north of Rainbow Springs and not too far from the historical ghost town of Juliet. On my recent visit to Rainbow Springs State Park, it was a Saturday and the parking lot was just starting to fill up. While I did have to wait in line to get in, there were only 3 or 4 families in front of me, so it didn't take long. After passing through the entrance, I was able to see that the swimming area of the spring was pretty crowded, which was okay. I wasn't there to swim this time. Instead, I wanted to walk the trails and see if I could find some of the old remnants of Juliet. Since the Juliette Cemetery is in a restricted part of the park, I wasn't able to access it. But I was able to see all of the man-made waterfalls and old cages from the theme park days in the 50s when they had a zoo. It was a quiet, peaceful walk around the park. There were others there, but it wasn't crowded at all. It was a nice hike on a beautiful Florida day. While I was there, I also purchased my annual state parks pass, which will allow me to explore Florida state parks for free for the remainder of the year because that's how I travel on a budget. And here we are. That wraps up our romantic series of Florida's ghost towns. If you haven't already, be sure to check out the first 2 videos in the series. Part 1 covers the towns of Montauk and Capulet, and last week's video covers the ghost town of Romeo. Next week, I'll be sharing with you my recent visit to Florida's ghost town of Gator, where I found a loot stash, so be sure to stay tuned for that as well. As always, be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons so you can be notified each time I upload. Until next time, friends, explore the world your way.